The domestic terrorists chose Morrison's shooting range because they wanted to make a statement about gun ownership. Three armed extremists with military training, attacking during peak hours when the range was full of families and veterans. What they didn't know was that the quiet range officer who checked IDs and enforced safety rules was Frank Rivera, a Force Recon Marine who had spent 2 tours in Vietnam perfecting the art of killing enemies before they knew he was there. Their first shot would be their last mistake. When evil chooses to strike at the innocent, it sometimes discovers that the protectors were already in position, waiting with skills earned in places where mercy was a luxury that got good people killed. Before we dive into this intense story of precision warfare, domestic terrorism, and the Marine who never stopped defending America, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like Frank's prove that some guardians never retire from protecting the innocent, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who still stand watch. Frank Rivera had been working as range safety officer at Morrison Shooting Range for exactly 7 years, 3 months, and 4 days. To the thousands of shooters who came through the facility, he was the courteous older man who checked memberships, enforced safety protocols, and helped newcomers learn proper firearms handling. What they didn't know was that Frank's encyclopedic knowledge of weapons, his instinctive understanding of ballistics, and his uncanny ability to predict where shots would land came from 2 tours in Vietnam as a Force Reconnaissance Marine. Morrison Range was one of the largest public shooting facilities in the tri-state area, with outdoor rifle ranges extending to 1,000 yards, multiple pistol ranges, and training areas used by local law enforcement and military units. Frank had memorized every sight line, every potential shooting position, and every tactical advantage the facility offered. Not because range management required it, but because Frank Rivera had been trained to assess any terrain for both offensive and defensive capabilities. Frank had enlisted in the Marines in 1970. Straight out of high school in a small Texas town where military service was considered both an honor and a duty. After completing boot camp at Parris Island and advanced infantry training, Frank had volunteered for Force Reconnaissance, the Marine Corps Elite Special Operations Unit that conducted deep reconnaissance and direct action missions behind enemy lines. Force Recon training had been brutal, designed to create Marines who could operate alone or in small teams in hostile territory for extended periods. Frank had learned advanced marksmanship, navigation, communications, and the art of remaining invisible while observing enemy positions. But most importantly, he had learned to kill with precision at distances that pushed the limits of both equipment and human capability. Frank's first deployment to Vietnam came in 1971, when he was assigned to a 4-man reconnaissance team operating in the dense jungles along the Cambodian border. Their mission was to identify and eliminate high-value targets while gathering intelligence on enemy troop movements. For 13 months, Frank had lived in an environment where every day brought the possibility of contact with enemy forces who knew the terrain better than any American ever could. The work had been unlike conventional combat operations. Frank's team operated without support, often spending weeks behind enemy lines, moving only at night and remaining hidden during daylight hours. When they encountered enemy soldiers, engagements had to be quick, silent, and decisive. Frank had become expert at eliminating targets at extreme range, often killing enemy snipers and officers before they knew Americans were in the area. Frank's second deployment had taken him to the Central Highlands, where his team conducted reconnaissance on North Vietnamese supply routes known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The mission parameters were simple: identify enemy logistics operations, and eliminate key personnel who were coordinating the movement of weapons and supplies to Viet Cong units operating in South Vietnam. It was during this deployment that Frank had earned his reputation as one of the most effective snipers in Force Recon. Operating with a modified M40 rifle, Frank had eliminated 73 confirmed enemy targets over an 8-month period, including several high-ranking officers whose deaths had significantly disrupted enemy operations in his area of responsibility. But Frank's most significant engagement had come during an operation to rescue a downed helicopter crew who had been captured by North Vietnamese forces. For 13 months, Frank had lived in an environment where every day brought the possibility of contact with enemy forces who knew the terrain better than any American ever could. The work had been unlike conventional combat operations. Frank's team operated without support, often spending weeks behind enemy lines, moving only at night and remaining hidden during daylight hours. When they encountered enemy soldiers, engagements had to be quick, silent, and decisive. Frank's team had infiltrated the prisoner camp and was coordinating the rescue when they discovered that the enemy had set a trap, using the captured Americans as bait to draw in rescue forces. Frank had been forced to engage multiple enemy positions simultaneously while his team extracted the prisoners. Using precision rifle fire, Frank had eliminated 17 enemy soldiers in a running firefight that lasted over 2 hours, allowing his team to successfully evacuate the captured airmen. The operation had earned Frank a Silver Star, but more importantly, it had demonstrated his ability to maintain precision accuracy under the extreme stress of combat operations. When Frank completed his military service in 1973, he had been offered positions with various government agencies that valued his specialized skills. But Frank had chosen to return to civilian life, using his GI Bill benefits to earn a degree in mechanical engineering and working in the defense industry for 30 years before retiring to a quieter life that included part-time work at Morrison Range. For 7 years, Frank had found peace in the routine of range operations, helping recreational shooters improve their accuracy, teaching firearms safety to newcomers, and occasionally providing advanced marksmanship instruction to law enforcement. Officers who recognized his expertise. His military past was known only to the range owner, who had hired Frank specifically because of his background and his ability to identify potential safety issues before they became problems. The Marines who used Morrison Range for training knew Frank as knowledgeable and professional. But they had no idea that the man checking their identification had once been part of the elite community of warriors who operated where conventional forces couldn't go. Frank's quiet demeanor and helpful attitude concealed decades of experience with weapons and tactics that most people only saw in movies. The attack began at 2:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon when the range was hosting its monthly precision rifle competition. Over 200 people were present, including families, competitive shooters, and a group of young Marines who were training for upcoming deployment. The atmosphere was relaxed, with the sounds of gunfire and conversation creating the familiar environment that Frank had come to associate with peaceful civilian life. Frank first noticed the threat when 3 men approached the range entrance in a tactical formation that immediately triggered his threat assessment training. They were moving with military precision, but without the relaxed confidence of legitimate shooters. Frank's Force Recon experience had taught him to identify potential enemies by their movement patterns, and these subjects were displaying behavior consistent with hostile intent. The subjects were carrying rifle cases and wearing civilian clothing, but Frank noticed tactical gear beneath their jackets and movement patterns that suggested coordinated planning. As they approached the entrance, Frank positioned himself to observe their actions while maintaining access to both his radio and the range emergency protocols. The attack began when the lead subject, later identified as Marcus Webb, a former Army infantry soldier with connections to domestic extremist groups, opened fire on families at the 100-yard pistol range. Webb was armed with a modified AR-15 with military accessories, and his initial burst of fire was aimed at maximizing civilian casualties rather than engaging any specific tactical targets. Frank's force recon training took over before his conscious mind could process the full scope of the attack. This wasn't random violence or mental health crisis. This was a coordinated terrorist operation designed to inflict maximum casualties on civilian targets. Frank immediately activated the range emergency lockdown procedures while simultaneously moving to engage the closest threat. The second attacker, identified as David Chen, a former Marine with dishonorable discharge who had been radicalized by online extremist propaganda, had positioned himself at the 300-yard range and was engaging targets with a scoped rifle. Chen's tactical positioning indicated military training, and his rate of accurate fire suggested combat experience. The third terrorist, Robert Martinez, had moved to the range's elevated observation deck and was providing overwatch with a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a high-capacity magazine. Martinez was attempting to control the facility's main exits while his partners engaged civilians who were trapped in the open shooting areas. Frank assessed the tactical situation with skills honed by decades of combat experience. 3 coordinated attackers with military training, multiple civilian casualties already occurring, law enforcement response estimated at 8 to 12 minutes. And over 200 potential hostages trapped in a facility with limited cover. Frank had to neutralize all 3 threats while minimizing civilian casualties and coordinating evacuation of wounded victims. Frank's first engagement was with Webb, who was closest to the largest concentration of civilians. Using movement techniques learned during force recon operations, Frank approached Webb's position while remaining concealed behind concrete barriers and shooting benches. Frank was armed only with his personal sidearm, a .45 caliber pistol that he carried for range security purposes. From a distance of 75 yards, Frank engaged Webb with precision pistol fire that immediately neutralized the threat. Frank's shot placement was textbook force recon methodology. Instant incapacitation with minimal risk of overpenetration that could endanger civilians behind the target. Frank's engagement of Webb alerted the other 2 terrorists to his presence, and they immediately shifted their focus from attacking civilians to engaging what they correctly identified as a military-trained opponent. Chen began engaging Frank's position with rifle fire, while Martinez attempted to coordinate a flanking maneuver from his elevated position. Frank realized that his pistol was inadequate for engaging the remaining 2 targets at their current ranges and tactical positions. Using equipment available at the range, Frank acquired a precision rifle from the facility's rental inventory, a .308 caliber weapon with optics that he was intimately familiar with from his military service. The engagement that followed demonstrated why Force Recon Marines had earned their reputation as the military's most elite marksmen. Frank used the range concrete barriers and steel shooting benches as cover while engaging Chen at 300 yards with precision rifle fire. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, with Frank's first shot eliminating Chen, while his follow-up shots prevented Martinez from maintaining his overwatch position. Martinez, realizing that he was facing a professionally trained opponent, attempted to withdraw from his elevated position while maintaining suppressive fire on Frank's location. But Frank had anticipated this tactical movement and had positioned himself to intercept Martinez's most likely escape route. The final engagement occurred at a range of 500 yards, with Frank using advanced marksmanship techniques learned during his Vietnam service to eliminate matinas while he was attempting to reach a vehicle that the terrorists had positioned for their escape. Frank's shot was taken under combat stress, with wounded civilians requiring immediate medical attention and the constant possibility that additional attackers were present. By the time the first law enforcement units arrived on scene, Frank had neutralized all 3 terrorist threats and was coordinating medical care for the 7 civilians who had been wounded during the initial attack. Frank's tactical response had lasted less than 8 minutes, but his use of precision marksmanship and tactical movement had prevented what investigators later determined could have been one of the deadliest domestic terrorist attacks in the region's history. The young Marines who had been training at the range when the attack occurred immediately recognized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been conducting advanced marksmanship training with his squad, approached Frank as emergency responders secured the scene. "Sir," Rodriguez said, "that was the most professional tactical response I've ever seen outside of a military operation. What's your background?" Frank looked at the young Marines who were staring at him with obvious respect and curiosity. For 7 years, he had successfully kept his military service private, but the circumstances of the terrorist attack had made concealment impossible. "Marine Force Reconnaissance," Frank replied simply. "Vietnam, 1971 to 1973. Rodriguez felt a chill of recognition. Force Recon Marines were legends in the Corps, warriors who had operated at levels of skill and courage that most Marines only heard about in stories. "How many tours, sir?" "2 deployments, mainly reconnaissance and direct action operations." Frank paused, then added quietly, "places that officially didn't exist." The implications were clear to every Marine present. Frank had been part of the classified operations that had taken Force Recon teams into Cambodia and Laos, conducting missions that weren't acknowledged by the U.S. government but were essential to the war effort. "Sir," Rodriguez continued, "my NCOs told us about Marines like you. They said Force Recon operators were the most dangerous individuals the Corps ever produced." Frank nodded once. "We did what needed to be done." The investigation that followed revealed that Frank had prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack that had been planned for months by a domestic extremist cell with connections to multiple hate groups. The terrorists had chosen Morrison Range specifically because of its high civilian population and symbolic significance to Second Amendment supporters. Frank's tactical response was analyzed by federal counterterrorism experts who noted that his precision marksmanship, tactical movement, and crisis management had demonstrated skills that were consistent with the most elite military special operations training. His ability to engage multiple targets at varying ranges while protecting civilians had prevented what could have been dozens of casualties. The FBI's Domestic Terrorism Task Force credited Frank with saving an estimated 40 to 60 lives through his immediate response and tactical expertise. The terrorists' original plan had included explosive devices that were designed to collapse portions of the range structure, creating additional casualties among trapped civilians. Frank's actions that day earned him recognition from law enforcement agencies, veteran organizations, and the local community. But Frank declined most interviews and public appearances, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves while maintaining the quiet professionalism that had characterized his military service. The Marines who had witnessed Frank's response began referring to him as the Ghost, a reference to his ability to move and engage targets with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Word spread through military networks about the Force Recon veteran who had single-handedly stopped a terrorist attack, and Morrison Range became an unofficial pilgrimage site for Marines who wanted to train where a legend had demonstrated the skills that made Force Reconnaissance the most elite unit in the Corps. Frank returned to his duties as Range Safety Officer, but with enhanced security responsibilities that recognized his unique qualifications for protecting the facility and its users. Other shooting ranges began recruiting former Special Operations personnel for security positions, recognizing that some threats required defenders who understood both civilian protection and military tactics. 6 months after the attack, Frank was approached by federal agencies that wanted to recruit him for counterterrorism training programs. Frank accepted a consulting position that allowed him to teach tactical marksmanship and crisis response to law enforcement officers while maintaining his primary job at Morrison Range. The most significant change was the establishment of a veteran training program at Morrison Range, where former military personnel could maintain their marksmanship skills while serving as an informal security force for the facility. Frank coordinated the program, using his military experience to identify veterans who had the skills and temperament for protective responsibilities. Frank Rivera never sought publicity for his actions during the terrorist attack. The skills he had used were earned in a war that many Americans preferred not to remember, fighting enemies who were uniforms and operated according to military protocols. But when domestic terrorists brought violence to his community, Frank had proven that some skills remained relevant regardless of the enemy's nationality or ideology. Morrison Range reopened 3 days after the attack with enhanced security measures and memorial plaques honoring the civilians who had been wounded during the terrorist assault. But for the families who had been present during the attack, the real memorial was the quiet man who had spent 50 years protecting Americans, first in Vietnamese jungles and finally at a civilian shooting range where he had chosen to make his stand against evil. So I ask you, have you ever witnessed someone respond to crisis with skills that seem to come from another era entirely? Someone whose calm precision under fire revealed training that most people only experience in their nightmares. Share their story in the comments. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that the most effective protectors are often those who learned their skills in places where failure meant death and success meant coming home alive. Thank you for watching. If Frank's story moved you, please subscribe and share this video. Help us honor those who carry their warrior skills into civilian life, ready to deploy deadly precision when evil threatens the innocent, proving that some Marines never truly retire from the mission of protecting America and Americans. Until next time, remember, the person checking your membership at the shooting range might once have been the one eliminating enemies at distances you couldn't imagine shooting accurately. Sometimes the most lethal protectors are hiding behind the most helpful smiles.